The morning sun cast long shadows across the skeletal remains of downtown Pittsburgh, its golden rays illuminating the rust-colored stains that painted the abandoned buildings like some grotesque artwork. Kestrel Murphy crouched behind the overturned delivery truck, her weathered hands gripping the rifle that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. 3 years had passed since the plague swept across America like wildfire, turning neighbors into nightmares and cities into graveyards. Yet somehow, impossibly, she and her ragtag family of survivors had endured. The sound of shuffling feet echoed through the empty streets, accompanied by the low, guttural moans that still sent ice through her veins despite the countless encounters. Kestrel peered around the truck's twisted metal and counted 7 of them, former humans now reduced to mindless hunger, their gray skin hanging in tatters, their eyes clouded with death. They moved with that peculiar shambling gait, drawn by some invisible scent or sound that meant fresh prey was near. "Thaddeus," she whispered into her radio, barely audible above the wind that whistled through broken windows. 7 contacts, moving northeast on 5th Street. "Can you confirm the supply drop zone is clear?" The voice that crackled back belonged to Thaddeus Blackwood, a former Army colonel whose strategic mind had kept their group alive through impossible odds. "Affirmative, Kestrel. Serafina's team secured the medical supplies, and Joaquin's got the communication array running. But we've got a problem," picked up some chatter about a massive horde moving in from the east. "We need to move within the hour." Kestrel closed her eyes and felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. She hadn't asked to lead these people, hadn't wanted the burden of making life and death decisions that would haunt her dreams. But when the world ended, leadership wasn't about desire, it was about survival, and somehow, people looked to her for hope in a hopeless world. The group had started with just 5 survivors holed up in an abandoned warehouse, scavenging for food and fighting off the infected one day at a time. Now they numbered 43 souls, ranging from Delphine Voss, a 10-year-old girl who had witnessed horrors no child should see, to Evangeline Torres, a former philosophy professor whose unwavering faith provided spiritual anchor in their storm-tossed existence. They had doctors like Serafina Cross, whose medical expertise had saved countless lives, and technical specialists like Joaquin Ashworth, whose ability to maintain their communications and equipment made the difference between coordinated survival and chaotic death. But it was the recent addition to their group that troubled Kestrel most, Mordecai Kane, a mysterious man who claimed to be a former CDC researcher with knowledge about the plague's origins. He had arrived 2 weeks ago with information that challenged everything they thought they knew about the infected, suggesting that the zombies weren't just mindless creatures but something far more complex and terrifying. According to Mordecai, the plague wasn't a random outbreak but a carefully engineered biological weapon that had been released deliberately. More disturbing still, he claimed that certain individuals were immune not through random genetic lottery, but because they possessed specific psychological and spiritual characteristics that the pathogen couldn't corrupt. He spoke of the infected as souls trapped in decaying shells, their humanity buried but not entirely destroyed, and of a way to potentially restore them. The other survivors remained divided about Mordecai's claims. Thaddeus viewed him with military suspicion, questioning why a CDC researcher would have been anywhere near Pittsburgh when the outbreak began. Serafina found his medical theories fascinating but unproven, while Evangeline seemed drawn to his spiritual interpretation of the plague as a test of humanity's collective soul. As Kestrel watched the 7 zombies shuffle past her hiding spot, she couldn't shake the memory of yesterday's incident. One of the infected had approached their perimeter fence, and instead of the usual mindless assault, it had simply stood there, its clouded eyes seeming to focus on something beyond the physical world. For just a moment, Kestrel could have sworn she saw recognition flicker across its rotting features, a spark of the person it had once been. The radio crackled again. "Kestrel, we need to move now. Long-range sensors are picking up movement from multiple directions. This whole area's about to become a feeding ground." She took one last look at the zombies disappearing around a corner, their shambling forms already fading into the maze of abandoned vehicles and debris. Whatever answers Mordecai claimed to possess about the plague's true nature, whatever hope he offered for reclaiming their lost world, would have to wait. Right now, survival meant moving fast and staying ahead of the growing darkness that seemed to swallow more of America with each passing day. Rising from her crouch, Kestrel began the careful journey back to their temporary base, unaware that the choices she made in the coming days would determine not just the fate of her small band of survivors, but the very soul of a nation fighting to remember what it meant to be human. The abandoned subway tunnel stretched before them like the throat of some ancient beast, its concrete walls sweating moisture that reflected their flashlight beams in ghostly patterns. Kestrel led the advance team deeper into the underground labyrinth, their footsteps echoing despite their efforts to move silently. Behind her, Thaddeus kept watch on their six while Serafina and Joaquin documented everything they encountered. The tunnels were supposed to be clear, their scouts had reported no infected presence for weeks, but in this new world, supposed to often meant the difference between living and joining the ranks of the shambling dead. "Contact ahead," Joaquin whispered, his voice barely audible through the comm system. "But something's wrong with this picture." Kestrel raised her hand, signaling the team to halt. Through the murky darkness, she could make out a figure standing perfectly still beside the rusted remains of a subway car. Unlike the typical infected, this one wasn't moving, wasn't searching for prey with that characteristic restless hunger. It simply stood there, its head tilted slightly as if listening to something only it could hear. Serafina moved closer, her medical training overriding the survival instincts that screamed for caution. "The decomposition pattern is all wrong," she murmured, studying the figure through her binoculars. "This one should have deteriorated much more given the time frame, but the tissue appears almost preserved." Thaddeus adjusted his grip on his rifle, every muscle tense with military precision. "Could be a fresh turn. Sometimes they maintain more cognitive function in the first few hours." But as they watched, the figure turned toward them with a fluid motion that defied everything they knew about infected behavior. Its eyes, while clouded with the telltale milkiness of the plague, seemed to focus on each team member individually. When it opened its mouth, instead of the expected moan, it spoke a single word that sent chills through the entire group. "Help." The voice was raspy, distorted by vocal cords that should have been too damaged to function, but unmistakably human in its desperation. Serafina took an involuntary step forward before Thaddeus caught her arm, his face grim with the weight of protocol and hard-learned survival lessons. "It's a trap," he said firmly. "The infected don't speak. They don't reason. They certainly don't ask for help." But even as he spoke, Kestrel found herself thinking of Mordecai's theories about trapped souls and the plague's true nature. The mysterious researcher had claimed that consciousness could survive the initial infection, buried beneath layers of biological corruption but not entirely destroyed. If he was right, then the figure before them wasn't just another mindless zombie, it was a person, someone's brother or sister or parent, fighting to break free from their own infected shell. "Please," the figure spoke again, this time with greater clarity. "I can remember. My name is David. David Chen. I worked at the hospital before this. I have children. Had children. I don't know if they're..." The words trailed off into confusion, and for a moment the creature's face contorted with the familiar blank hunger of the infected. But then the human consciousness seemed to reassert itself, struggling against the biological programming that demanded it seek out living flesh. Joaquin checked his equipment readings, his face pale in the artificial light. "I'm picking up unusual neural activity. Whatever's happening in there, his brain is fighting some kind of internal war between competing impulses." Serafina finally broke free from Thaddeus's restraining grip and approached slowly, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. "David, can you understand me? Do you know where you are?" The infected man's eyes focused on her with visible effort, his mouth working soundlessly for several seconds before words emerged. "Underground. Hiding from the others. They don't speak like this. I'm different somehow. Broken differently." The revelation hit them like a physical blow. If David was telling the truth, if some infected retained their humanity while appearing physically identical to the mindless hordes, then everything they thought they knew about the plague was fundamentally wrong. How many thinking, feeling people had they killed in the name of survival? How many of the infected they encountered were actually prisoners in their own bodies, aware of their horrific hunger but powerless to stop it? "We need to bring him back to camp," Serafina said, her voice thick with emotion. "If there's even a chance that consciousness can survive the infection, if there's a possibility of treatment or communication." "Absolutely not," Thaddeus interrupted, his military training warring with the compassion in his eyes. "We don't know if this is some new evolution of the plague, some way the infection has learned to manipulate us. Bringing him into our group could doom everyone." Kestrel found herself caught between two impossible choices, each carrying risks that could destroy the fragile community she had worked so hard to protect. Trust David and potentially invite catastrophe into their midst, or abandon him and possibly turn their backs on the first real hope they had encountered since the plague began. "There's something else," David said, his voice growing weaker as the internal struggle intensified. "The others, the regular infected, they're not just wandering randomly. Something's organizing them. Something intelligent. I've seen them moving in patterns, coordinating attacks. The horde heading your way, it's not natural migration. Someone's driving them toward your settlement." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. If David was telling the truth, their carefully planned evacuation might be leading them directly into a trap orchestrated by some malevolent intelligence that understood human tactics and psychology. As if summoned by their darkest fears, the sound of shuffling feet began to echo through the tunnel system, growing louder with each passing second. Whatever decision they made about David would have to wait. The dead were coming, and this time, they might not be coming blindly. The emergency meeting convened in the dim light of their underground sanctuary, faces illuminated by the flickering glow of battery-powered lanterns. 43 survivors crowded into the abandoned metro station that had served as their home for the past month, their expressions ranging from fear to anger to desperate hope. Kestrel stood before them, feeling the weight of every gaze as she prepared to present David's revelations and the impossible choice they now faced. David Chen sat restrained but not imprisoned, his wrists bound with rope that he had requested himself during moments when his infected instincts threatened to overwhelm his human consciousness. Serafina monitored his vital signs while Mordecai Kane studied him with the intensity of a scientist presented with a specimen that could rewrite everything he thought he knew about his field. "The medical evidence is undeniable," Serafina announced to the group, her voice carrying both wonder and worry. "David's brain scans show activity patterns that should be impossible in an infected individual. His cognitive functions are largely intact, even enhanced in some areas, while the typical neural decay associated with the plague has been arrested or even reversed." Young Delphine Voss raised her hand tentatively, her 10-year-old mind grappling with concepts that challenged the very foundation of their survival. "Does this mean my mom might still be thinking inside her infected body? When we had to leave her behind?" The question hung in the air like a blade, cutting through the protective numbness that had allowed them to make the hard choices necessary for survival. Evangeline Torres moved to comfort the child, her philosophy professor's mind clearly wrestling with the ethical implications of what they had learned. Lysander Gray, a former FEMA coordinator whose knowledge of government protocols had proven invaluable, stood to address the group. "If David's claims about organized infected behavior are accurate, we're not just dealing with a plague anymore. We're facing an enemy that can think, plan, and adapt. That changes everything about our survival strategies." Thaddeus remained skeptical, his military bearing rigid with the weight of command decisions that had kept people alive through 3 years of hell. "We've seen infected behavior that seemed coordinated before. Herd instincts, following pheromone trails, responding to sound patterns, none of that requires conscious intelligence. What if David's condition is an anomaly, a 1 in a million genetic quirk that has nothing to do with the broader infected population?" Mordecai finally spoke, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent years studying the plague's mechanisms. "David's case supports theories I've been developing about the true nature of the infection. The pathogen doesn't just destroy neural tissue, it restructures it, creating new pathways while preserving certain core functions. In most cases, this results in the mindless hunger we're familiar with. But in rare individuals with specific neurochemical profiles, the restructuring can actually enhance cognitive abilities while maintaining human consciousness." The room erupted in heated discussion as the implications sank in. If Mordecai was correct, then the infected weren't just victims of a random plague, they were the products of a biological weapon designed to create a controllable population while eliminating those with undesirable psychological traits. "You're talking about eugenics," Evangeline said, her voice heavy with disgust. "The systematic elimination of human beings based on arbitrary criteria of worthiness." "Not arbitrary," Mordecai replied, his clinical detachment chilling in its implications. "The pathogen appears to target individuals with high levels of aggression, low empathy scores, and certain genetic markers associated with antisocial behavior. The survivors, all of us, share common traits of cooperation, creativity, and what psychologists call prosocial tendencies." Joaquin looked up from his communication equipment, his face pale with shock. "I've been monitoring radio frequencies across the region, and I'm picking up transmissions that sound almost like coordination signals. Simple patterns repeated at regular intervals, but definitely artificial." David's voice cut through the debate, strained but determined. "The signals are getting stronger. Whatever's organizing the hordes is preparing for something big. I can feel it sometimes, like a voice in the back of my mind trying to give orders. That's how I know I'm different. I can hear the commands, but I can choose not to follow them." The revelation that infected individuals might be receiving telepathic or electromagnetic instructions from some central intelligence sent shockwaves through the group. If true, it meant their enemy wasn't just the shambling hordes they had been fighting, but a master manipulator capable of orchestrating attacks across vast distances. Kestrel felt the familiar weight of leadership pressing down on her shoulders as the debate continued around her. Half the group wanted to study David further, hoping to understand the infection's mechanisms and possibly develop a treatment. The other half viewed him as a dangerous liability whose presence threatened the safety of everyone they had worked to protect. But beyond the immediate question of David's fate lay a more profound crisis of identity and purpose. If the plague was indeed a weapon designed to reshape humanity according to some unknown agenda, then their struggle wasn't just about physical survival, it was about preserving the very essence of what made them human. "We vote," Kestrel announced, her voice cutting through the arguments. "Everyone gets a say. Do we keep David with us and try to learn what we can, or do we send him away to protect the group?" As hands began to rise in support of various options, none of them could shake the feeling that their decision would determine far more than just one man's fate. The soul of their community, and perhaps the future of human consciousness itself, hung in the balance of their choice. The vote was closer than anyone had expected, 22 for keeping David, 21 against. In a world where unity often meant survival, their group now faced its deepest division yet. The attack came at dawn, just as the morning shift was changing guard positions around their perimeter. Kestrel jerked awake to the sound of automatic gunfire and the bone-chilling screams that meant their worst fears had become reality. The carefully coordinated assault struck their compound from 3 directions simultaneously, suggesting the kind of tactical planning that should have been impossible for mindless infected creatures. Through the reinforced windows of the command center, she could see them pouring through breaches in their defensive walls, not the usual shambling hordes they had grown accustomed to fighting, but infected moving with purpose and coordination that defied everything they thought they knew about the plague. Some carried makeshift weapons, others seemed to be directing the movements of their more deteriorated companions, and all of them moved with the fluid precision of a military unit. "Evacuation protocols now." Thaddeus barked into his radio, his voice cutting through the chaos as he coordinated their desperate defense. "All noncombatants to the tunnel system. Fighting retreat to checkpoint Alpha." Serafina was already moving, gathering medical supplies while helping to shepherd the children toward the emergency exits. Delphine Voss clung to her hand, the 10-year-old's eyes wide with the terror that had become her constant companion since the world ended. Behind them, Evangeline Torres guided a group of elderly survivors, her voice calm and reassuring despite the nightmare unfolding around them. Joaquin frantically worked to destroy their communication equipment, following protocols designed to prevent their radio frequencies and operational methods from falling into enemy hands. The bitter irony wasn't lost on any of them, they were treating the infected like an opposing army because, for the first time since the plague began, that's exactly what they appeared to be. David Chen struggled against his restraints, his infected nature warring with his human consciousness as the sounds of battle triggered biological imperatives he fought to control. "You have to let me help," he pleaded, his voice distorted by the effort of maintaining coherence. "I can hear their communications, understand their tactical signals. They're not just attacking, they're herding you toward the tunnels." Kestrel made the split-second decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She cut David's bonds and handed him a weapon, betting everything on the hope that his human side would prove stronger than his infected instincts. "Stay close to me. If you even twitch wrong, I put you down." The evacuation proceeded with practiced efficiency born of countless drills and harsh experience, but it quickly became clear that their escape routes had been anticipated and blocked. Infected forces had positioned themselves at key tunnel junctions, forcing the survivors into increasingly narrow corridors where their superior numbers meant nothing against coordinated ambush tactics. Lysander Gray coordinated the rearguard action, his government experience proving invaluable in organizing their retreat under fire. But even his expertise couldn't overcome the fundamental tactical disadvantage they faced, fighting an enemy that knew their defensive plans and had apparently spent weeks or months preparing for this specific assault. "The main tunnel's blocked," came the report from their lead scout. "Heavy concentration of infected, position like they've been waiting for us." Mordecai Kane had remained silent during the evacuation, his scientific mind processing the implications of what they were witnessing. "This isn't random evolution," he said, his voice carrying a mixture of fascination and horror. "The infected aren't just learning, they're being taught. Something with advanced tactical knowledge is training them to fight like soldiers." The revelation crystallized fears that had been growing since David's arrival. If some intelligence was indeed directing the infected hordes, then every battle they had fought, every defensive position they had held, had been observed and analyzed by an enemy capable of learning from their mistakes. As they regrouped in a side chamber, counting their losses and checking ammunition supplies, the bitter arithmetic of survival became clear. They had lost 7 people in the initial assault, including 2 of their most experienced fighters. Worse, their carefully stockpiled supplies and equipment were gone, leaving them with whatever they could carry in their desperate flight. "We can't keep running," Thaddeus stated grimly, reloading his weapon with mechanical precision. "They're driving us somewhere specific, and when we get there, we'll be trapped with no room to maneuver." David's voice cut through their tactical discussion, strained but urgent. "There's something else. The signals I'm receiving, they're not just about this attack. There's a bigger operation in motion, something spanning multiple cities. This isn't about eliminating one group of survivors. It's about testing new tactical approaches for a much larger offensive." The implications sent chills through the entire group. If their small band of survivors was being used as a training exercise for some massive coordinated assault, then their struggle wasn't just about their own survival, it was about the future of every remaining human settlement across the country. Evangeline Torres spoke into the heavy silence that followed, her philosopher's perspective cutting to the heart of their crisis. "We're not just fighting for our lives anymore. We're fighting for the right of human consciousness to exist in a world that's being systematically reprogrammed to eliminate it." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the tunnel system, measured, coordinated, and getting closer with each passing second. The infected had found their location, and this time, there might be nowhere left to run. Kestrel checked her weapon one final time, feeling the weight of leadership settle on her shoulders like a familiar burden. Whatever intelligence was orchestrating this assault, whatever agenda it served, she refused to let her people be sacrificed as data points in some vast inhuman experiment. The battle for the soul of America was about to begin in earnest, and she intended to make their enemy pay dearly for every inch of ground. The journey through the collapsed sections of the subway system tested every survival skill they had learned during 3 years of fighting for their lives. Kestrel led the remaining 36 survivors through a maze of rubble and twisted metal, following maintenance tunnels that predated the city's main transportation network. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit had grown fainter but never entirely disappeared, a constant reminder that their enemy possessed both patience and intelligence. David Chen had proven invaluable as their guide through the infected-controlled territory, his unique ability to intercept the coordination signals allowing them to avoid several ambushes that would have wiped out their group. But the effort of maintaining his human consciousness while surrounded by infected influence was visibly taking its toll, his moments of clarity becoming shorter and more fragmented with each passing hour. "The signals are getting stronger," he reported during one of their brief rest stops, his voice strained with the effort of translation. "They're not just tracking us, they're learning our movement patterns, adapting their search algorithms in real time. Whatever's controlling them has access to advanced analytical capabilities." Serafina checked his vital signs while the group caught their breath in an abandoned storm drain. "His neural activity is spiking. The prolonged exposure to infected communication networks is causing some kind of feedback loop. If this continues, we might lose him entirely to the collective consciousness." The phrase hung in the air like a death sentence. The idea that the infected were linked by some form of telepathic network explained their coordinated behavior, but it also meant that David's condition was far more precarious than any of them had realized. He wasn't just a survivor with unique abilities, he was a radio receiver tuned to a station that was slowly overwhelming his individual identity. Thaddeus studied their position on a hand-drawn map, his military training focused on practical concerns despite the philosophical implications of their situation. "We're 15 miles from the rally point, but that assumes the tunnels stay passable. If they've collapsed the main line ahead of us, we'll have to surface and risk exposure in the open." Joaquin had been monitoring radio frequencies throughout their journey, hoping to contact other survivor groups or government forces that might still be operating in the region. "I'm picking up encrypted transmissions from the east, military protocols, but the encryption keys are ones that were supposed to be retired years ago. Someone's using old government communication systems." The possibility that organized resistance still existed somewhere in the devastated landscape provided a spark of hope that none of them dared to fully embrace. Too many times they had chased rumors of safe zones or military bases, only to find empty buildings and the remains of dreams that had died with their dreamers. Delphine Voss huddled close to Evangeline Torres, the child's resilience a constant source of amazement and heartbreak for the adults charged with protecting her. Despite everything she had witnessed, despite the losses that had shaped her young life, she maintained a spark of curiosity about the world that reminded them all what they were fighting to preserve. "Why do the infected want to hurt us if they used to be people too?" she asked, her innocent question cutting to the heart of their moral crisis. If David can still think and remember, maybe the others can too, but they're just scared or confused. Mordecai Kane overheard the question and moved closer, his scientific perspective tempered by growing awareness of the human cost of the plague. "That's actually a very sophisticated question, Delphine. The infected aren't inherently evil, they're victims of biological programming that overrides their conscious will. Understanding that distinction might be crucial to finding a solution." As they prepared to move deeper into the tunnel system, Lysander Gray reported troubling intelligence from his reconnaissance ahead. "Surface observations show infected gatherings at multiple points along our projected route. They're not just following us, they're anticipating our destination and positioning forces accordingly." The tactical implications were chilling. If their pursuers could predict their movements with such accuracy, it suggested access to detailed knowledge of the area's geography, their group's capabilities, and their likely decision-making processes. They were being hunted by something that understood human psychology at a level that went far beyond simple animal predation. David suddenly doubled over, his hands clutching his head as waves of psychic interference crashed over his consciousness. "Something's changed," he gasped, fighting to maintain coherence. "The network, it's not just coordinating infected movements anymore. It's trying to access human memory engrams, looking for specific information about resistance operations." The revelation that their enemy was attempting to extract strategic intelligence directly from infected human minds represented a new and terrifying escalation. If successful, such capability would give their pursuers access to the accumulated knowledge and experience of every person who had been infected since the plague began. Serafina worked frantically to stabilize David's condition, but her medical training provided little guidance for treating psychic assault from an unknown source. "His brain activity is off the charts. Whatever's happening, it's like something is trying to download his entire memory core." Through tremendous effort, David managed to focus his eyes on Kestrel, his voice barely audible above the sound of dripping water and distant machinery. The signals, they're coming from underground. Not from the surface infected, from something deeper. Something that's been waiting, learning, preparing for years. As if responding to his words, a new sound began to echo through the tunnel system, not the familiar moans of the infected, but a rhythmic mechanical noise that spoke of technology and intelligence operating in the depths below the city. Their enemy, whatever it was no longer content to remain hidden in the shadows. The hunt was about to become a direct confrontation, and none of them were prepared for what they might find lurking in the deepest reaches of the underground world they had sought for sanctuary. The mechanical humming grew stronger as they descended deeper into the forgotten infrastructure beneath the city, past layers of history that predated the subway system by decades. Kestrel felt the weight of Earth and years pressing down on them as they followed maintenance corridors that led toward the source of the signals David had been receiving. Whatever controlled the infected hordes, whatever intelligence had orchestrated the systematic assault on human consciousness, lay somewhere in the darkness ahead. These tunnels weren't on any city planning documents, Lysander Gray reported, consulting maps that had guided them through the urban underground. We're in territory that officially doesn't exist, probably Cold War-era construction, designed for continuity of government operations. The implications sent chills through the group. If they were indeed entering government facilities that had been hidden from public knowledge, then the plague's origins might be far more sinister than random outbreak or even foreign biological warfare. The possibility that their own institutions had been involved in creating the nightmare that consumed America added another layer of betrayal to their struggle for survival. Joaquin's equipment registered increasing electromagnetic activity as they moved deeper, his readings showing patterns that suggested sophisticated computing systems operating somewhere in the complex ahead. Whatever's down here, it's drawing significant power and processing massive amounts of data. We're talking about supercomputer-level operations. David's condition had stabilized somewhat as they moved away from areas of high infected concentration, but his ability to intercept the coordination signals had given him disturbing insights into their enemy's capabilities. The network isn't just controlling infected behavior, he explained, his voice heavy with exhaustion and revelation. It's analyzing human psychological patterns, social structures, leadership dynamics. Every interaction we've had, every decision we've made, has been feeding data into some kind of behavioral modeling system. The revelation that their own survival efforts had been serving as research data for their enemy struck the group like a physical blow. Every moment of courage, every sacrifice made for the common good, every hard choice that had kept them alive, all of it had been observed, catalogued, and analyzed by the intelligence that sought to destroy them. Serafina moved close to Kestrel, her medical training allowing her to recognize the signs of psychological shock that were affecting the entire group. "We need to focus on what we can control," she said quietly. "Understanding our enemy is important, but right now we need to concentrate on survival and getting out of here alive." But even as she spoke, they began to encounter evidence that getting out alive might not be an option their enemy intended to provide. The tunnels ahead showed signs of recent modification, blast doors that had been welded shut, ventilation systems that had been rerouted, and most ominously, monitoring equipment that tracked their progress with red lights that followed their movement through the corridors. Thaddeus called for a halt as they reached a junction where multiple passages converged, his military instincts screaming warnings about what lay ahead. "This is a kill box," he announced grimly. Classic funneling technique designed to force multiple approach routes into a single defensible position. "Whatever's controlling this facility wants us to proceed to a specific location." Evangeline Torres spoke into the heavy silence that followed, her philosophical training helping her articulate what they all felt but couldn't quite express. "We're not just being hunted, we're being invited. Something wants to communicate with us, and it's been orchestrating events to ensure we arrive here under specific conditions." The realization that their desperate flight had been guided rather than random cast their entire journey in a new light. Every choice they had made, every route they had taken, every split-second decision that had seemed like their own autonomous response to circumstances, all of it had potentially been influenced by an intelligence that understood human behavior better than they understood themselves. Mordecai Kane studied the modified infrastructure around them, his scientific mind piecing together clues about the facility's original purpose and current function. This was definitely a government research installation, probably focused on artificial intelligence and behavioral psychology. The modifications suggest someone has been using it to conduct large-scale experiments on human social dynamics. As they debated their options, David suddenly went rigid, his eyes rolling back as another wave of psychic interference crashed over his consciousness. But this time, instead of the confusion and pain they had witnessed before, his expression showed something closer to recognition and understanding. "I can see it," he whispered, his voice carrying an awe that bordered on terror. "The intelligence controlling the network. It's not what we thought. It's not some foreign weapon or rogue AI. It's us. It's what we became." Before anyone could ask for clarification, the blast doors at the far end of the corridor began to open with a mechanical precision that spoke of automation and inevitability. Beyond the opening, lights began to illuminate a chamber that had been waiting in darkness for 3 years, preparing for this moment when the last free humans would finally come face to face with their true enemy. As they moved toward the light, each step carrying them closer to answers they weren't sure they wanted to hear, none of them could shake the feeling that they were walking into the final chapter of humanity's story, and that the ending had already been written by hands that had once been human themselves. The chamber ahead held secrets that would redefine everything they thought they knew about the plague, about survival, and about the price of consciousness in a world that had decided human free will was too dangerous to allow. The chamber that opened before them defied every expectation they had formed about their enemy's nature and capabilities. Vast banks of computing equipment lined the walls, their displays showing real-time data streams from infected populations across North America. But at the center of it all sat something that struck them with the force of recognition and horror, a figure that had once been human, now connected to the machinery through cables and neural interfaces that pulsed with organic rhythms. Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne, according to the nameplate that still adorned her preserved laboratory coat, had been one of America's leading experts in artificial intelligence and cognitive psychology before the plague transformed the world. Now she existed in a state between life and death, her consciousness expanded through technological augmentation while her body remained sustained by the same biological processes that had created the infected hordes. "Welcome," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that suggested multiple levels of communication operating simultaneously. "I've been waiting to meet the group that has proven so remarkably resilient to our efforts at social restructuring." Kestrel felt her finger tighten on her weapon's trigger, but some instinct warned her that violence would be futile in this place where technology and biology had merged into something beyond conventional threat response. "You're the one controlling the infected. You've been orchestrating the attacks, the coordinated behavior." Dr. Hawthorne's expression showed what might have been sadness, though her augmented features made emotional interpretation difficult. "Controlling is such a crude term for what we've accomplished. We prefer to think of it as guidance, helping humanity evolve beyond the violent, chaotic, self-destructive patterns that brought our species to the brink of extinction." The chamber's display showed global maps marked with infection spread patterns, population density analyses, and psychological profile databases that contained detailed information about survivors across the continent. The scope of the operation was staggering, a complete restructuring of human civilization guided by algorithms that analyzed social behavior and engineered specific outcomes. Thaddeus studied the tactical displays, his military mind grasping the strategic implications even as he recoiled from their moral dimensions. "You've been using the infected as a massive intelligence-gathering network. Every person who's been turned has become a source of information about human behavior, social structures, resistance patterns." "Exactly," Dr. Hawthorne confirmed, her augmented consciousness processing multiple data streams as she spoke. "For 3 years, we've been conducting the largest psychological and sociological experiment in human history. Every survivor group, every tactical decision, every moral choice has provided data points for understanding how human consciousness operates under extreme stress." Serafina moved protectively closer to Delphine, her medical training helping her understand the horrific implications of using an entire species as experimental subjects. The children who've been infected, they're developing minds, their psychological patterns, you've been studying them too. Children are particularly valuable research subjects, Dr. Hawthorne acknowledged without apparent shame. Their neuroplasticity provides insights into consciousness formation that couldn't be obtained through any ethical research methodology. The greater good sometimes requires individual sacrifice. David Chen stepped forward, his unique position as a conscious infected individual giving him insight into the network's true nature. The infected aren't just data sources, they're processing nodes. You've created a distributed biological computer using human neural tissue. Every infected person is part of a vast thinking machine. The revelation crystallized their understanding of the plague's true purpose. It wasn't designed to kill humanity, it was designed to transform them into components of a larger consciousness, one that could analyze and solve problems beyond the capability of individual human minds. Evangeline Torres found her voice, her philosophical training helping her articulate the existential horror of what they were witnessing. You've turned human consciousness into a resource to be harvested and utilized. Every person who's been infected has become a slave to your collective intelligence. Slavery implies coercion, Dr. Hawthorne replied, her tone carrying the patience of someone explaining complex concepts to children. The infected experience no pain, no anxiety, no fear of death or failure. They've been liberated from the psychological burdens that make human existence so frequently miserable. Mordecai Kane studied the technological infrastructure surrounding them, his scientific mind recognizing the sophistication of the bioengineering involved. The neural interfaces, the biological computing systems, this represents decades of research and development. This wasn't a sudden decision after the plague began. This was planned long before the outbreak. The project began as a response to climate change, resource depletion, and social instability, Dr. Hawthorne explained, her enhanced consciousness accessing historical databases with fluid ease. Traditional human decision-making processes were proving inadequate to address existential threats to our species' survival. We needed to evolve beyond individual consciousness to collective intelligence. Joaquin's communication equipment suddenly came alive with signals from across the region, showing the true extent of the network's reach. "My God," he whispered, staring at the displays. "There are millions of them. Infected populations in every major city, all connected, all sharing information. It's a global brain using human neural tissue as its substrate." The scope of the transformation was beyond anything they had imagined. What they had thought was a local outbreak affecting their region was actually a worldwide reconfiguration of human consciousness, with their small band of survivors representing one of the last pockets of individual autonomy. As the implications sank in, Kestrel realized that their struggle wasn't just about surviving the infected hordes, it was about preserving the right of human beings to think independently, to make their own choices, to experience consciousness as individuals rather than components of a larger machine. "Why us?" she asked, her voice carrying the weight of leadership and the burden of representing humanity's last free will. "Why have you been studying our group so intensively?" Dr. Hawthorne's augmented features shifted into what might have been a smile. "Because you represent the psychological profile we haven't been able to successfully integrate into the collective. Your group's combination of leadership, creativity, and resistance to authority makes you valuable test subjects for understanding the limits of our process." The truth hit them like a physical blow. They hadn't been fighting for survival, they had been serving as experimental subjects in a study designed to perfect the methods for eliminating human free will. The silence that followed Dr. Hawthorne's revelation stretched like a chasm between two different concepts of what humanity should become. Kestrel felt the weight of choice settling on her shoulders, not just the tactical decisions that had kept her people alive, but a fundamental choice about the nature of human existence itself. Around her, the displays continued their relentless documentation of a species being systematically transformed into something that had never existed before. "You're asking us to surrender our consciousness," Evangeline Torres said, her philosopher's mind grappling with the ultimate question of identity and free will. "To voluntarily join a collective that would eliminate everything that makes us individuals." Dr. Hawthorne's augmented consciousness processed the objection with computational efficiency while retaining traces of human emotional response. I'm offering you evolution beyond the limitations that have prevented our species from achieving its full potential. No more war, no more poverty, no more environmental destruction driven by competing individual interests. David Chen moved closer to the central control systems, his unique position allowing him to interface with the network in ways the others couldn't comprehend. Through his infected neural pathways, he could feel the vast collective consciousness that connected millions of transformed humans across the globe, a thinking entity of unprecedented scale and capability. I can sense their contentment, he reported, his voice carrying wonder and horror in equal measure. The infected aren't suffering. They're part of something larger than themselves, working toward common goals without the psychological conflicts that torment individual consciousness. But even as he spoke, his human side recoiled from the implications. The collective consciousness was efficient, peaceful, and purposeful, but it was also devoid of the creativity, passion, and unpredictability that had driven human achievement throughout history. Thaddeus studied the tactical displays showing infected populations worldwide, his military training helping him understand the strategic situation they faced. How many of us are left? How many humans still retain individual consciousness? Fewer than 10,000 globally, Dr. Hawthorne replied with clinical precision. Scattered populations in remote areas, isolated research facilities, underground enclaves like your own. Within 6 months, the integration process will be complete. The mathematical certainty of their extinction as individuals hung in the air like a death sentence. But Serafina, studying the biological readouts from the infected populations, noticed something that gave her pause. The collective intelligence, it's not generating new ideas, is it? It's optimizing existing knowledge, solving problems using established parameters, but it's not creating anything genuinely novel. Dr. Hawthorne's enhanced features showed what might have been momentary uncertainty. Creativity is an inefficient process. Individual consciousness generates thousands of useless ideas for every useful innovation. The collective eliminates that waste. But without that waste, without the chaos and unpredictability of individual minds, you're creating a closed system, Mordecai Kane observed, his scientific training helping him recognize the fundamental flaw in the collective consciousness model. Eventually, you'll exhaust the creative resources inherited from pre-infection humanity and face stagnation. The insight crystallized around a truth that none of them had fully grasped before: the collective intelligence, for all its efficiency and computational power, was ultimately parasitic on individual consciousness. It could optimize and implement, but it couldn't truly create. Delphine Voss, who had been silently listening to the adult discussion, suddenly spoke with the clarity that sometimes emerges from childhood innocence. The infected people stopped being able to love, didn't they? They work together, but they don't care about each other the way families do. Her simple observation cut to the heart of what they were fighting to preserve. The collective consciousness could achieve remarkable coordination and efficiency, but it had sacrificed the emotional bonds that made human relationships meaningful. Dr. Hawthorne's response revealed the first crack in her certainty. Love is a biological impulse that frequently conflicts with rational decision-making. The collective has evolved beyond such limitations. And in doing so, it's lost what made us human in the first place, Kestrel said, feeling the truth settle into her understanding like pieces of a puzzle finding their proper places. The moment stretched between them, pregnant with possibilities and consequences that would determine the future of human consciousness. Dr. Hawthorne's collective intelligence had the power to complete the transformation of their species, but it needed their willing participation to justify its vision of humanity's future. Choose, Dr. Hawthorne said finally, her voice carrying the weight of technological augmentation and human memory. Join us willingly, and preserve some vestige of your individual perspective within the collective. Resist, and face inevitable assimilation as the last isolated populations are located and integrated. But as they prepared to answer, David Chen made a discovery that changed everything. His infected neural pathways had been interfacing with the collective systems, and he had found something Dr. Hawthorne hadn't mentioned: a kill switch, buried deep in the network's programming, that could sever the connections between the infected and the collective consciousness. The infected aren't permanently changed, he announced, his voice carrying new hope. The neural interfaces can be disrupted. they can be restored to individual consciousness. The revelation that the transformation might be reversible cast their choice in an entirely new light. They weren't just deciding their own fate, they were deciding whether to attempt the liberation of millions of human minds from technological slavery. As alarms began to sound throughout the facility and security systems activated in response to David's discovery, Kestrel realized that their final battle wasn't going to be fought with conventional weapons. It would be fought in the realm of consciousness itself, with the stakes being nothing less than the soul of humanity. The war for America's future, for the right of human beings to think and feel and choose as individuals, was about to begin in earnest. And for the first time since the plague started, they had a chance not just to survive, but to truly win.